Mindsetters, welcome to a Thursday show. I am Looney and Michelle is with me today. How are you, Michelle?
Fine, thanks, and you, Looney?
I'm doing good. What are we doing for the grade 12 today for geography?
We're looking at issues involved with rural settlements today.
All right, cool. Mindsetters, you heard it. We're doing issues in rural settlements. So I hope you guys are excited for the show. Just to remind you guys how to get a hold of us, facebook.com is our Facebook page /LearnExtra. @LearnExtra is Twitter. And then you can download all the show notes, the videos, and the schedules on learn.mindset.co.za. And then if you want to stand yourself a chance to win this awesome Casio calculator, all you need to do is complete all the test yourself questions, fill in your details, and then press the submit button. I have posted all the information on our Facebook page, so make sure you check that out. But remember, guys, you have all the time in the world. Okay, not all the time. It's Thursday today. Entries close tomorrow at 12 in the afternoon. So make sure you complete the test yourself questions to stand yourself a chance to win this awesome calculator. Congratulations to Zandile for winning this awesome calculator. So you'll be getting a Casio calculator. Oh, from Casio. I was just about to say probably bought by Casio calculator. Duh. Anyway, guys, time for the lesson. So, Michelle.
Hi, guys. Sorry, I'm just getting the screen here. All right. In this lesson, we're going to do a few very important concepts with issues in rural settlements. It's a little bit different from what we looked at last week, where we looked at just the basic theory. But most of the stuff that we're going to do today is extremely logical. So it's really not a difficult section. Let's have a look at what we're going to do. In this lesson today, we're going to explain the concept of rural-urban migration. We're going to discuss the push and pull factors that cause rural-urban migration. We're also going to discuss the consequences of rural depopulation. We're going to explore the concept of social justice relative to rural settlement problems. And lastly, today we're going to describe rural development strategies. Before we get there, however, let's have a look at our challenge question. You need to explain why large proportions of populations in provinces like Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and the Eastern Cape, they are still living in rural settlements, especially in a day and age where most of our population is in urban settlements. What is the underlying factor there? Let's see if you can answer that one later on. First of all, we need to have a look at the concept of rural-urban migration. So you mustn't confuse it with other concepts like urbanization. They're quite similar in a way, but when you're writing it out in your exam, you need to make sure that you learn the definitions word for word, because they won't accept any other variations. If we have a look at the concept of rural-urban migration, you need to always state it's the movement of people from rural areas like villages, hamlets, isolated farmsteads, to urban areas or cities and towns. Not to be confused with the process of urbanization, which means there is an increase in the percentage of people living in towns and cities. All right, so make sure that you get those definitions right. When we're dealing with rural-urban migration, we're going to look at push and pull factors, but we need to also look at what happens to the people who move to cities and also the consequences of those that are left behind. So let's have a look at a couple of those. We need to look at problems that are faced by rural-urban migrants. First of all, they generally have a lack of education. Right? The standard of education in rural areas is sadly below standard that we get in our urban areas. So they battle to adapt to that new lifestyle. Second one, their travel costs are huge. In South Africa, you're traveling hundreds of kilometers at a time sometimes, and that's very expensive with costs for petrol, etc. They have a lack of capital. They don't have enough money to buy a house, for example. They travel a far distance. They have to adapt to a new lifestyle, which is always a challenge. And also, sometimes they're misinformed about the new place. They're told all these things about how many jobs there are available, the bright lights of the city, and how much better a lifestyle it is. But once they get there, they actually experience a rather different situation. So they often ask in an exam the concept of rural-urban migration, and they also ask you what problems are they going to face once they reach those cities and towns. Let's have a look at the next part. We need to look at push and pull factors. Now, people always get this mistaken in an exam. You need to remember, firstly, that push factors are things that are not nice. They're undesirable things that make you want to leave a place. When we're discussing pull factors, those are drawing you towards the new settlement. So they are nice things. They are attractive things, like the bright lights of the city life, better services, etc. Let's have a look at some of those push and pull factors. Firstly, the definition: push factors are undesirable, so nasty things that cause people to leave a settlement. Pull factors are desirable factors that draw people towards a settlement. Now, in your textbooks, and if you just Google push and pull factors, it'll come up with a variety of things. So push factors, those are the things that are not so nice. Things like population pressure cause people to want to leave a rural town. Population pressure means that the amount of people that there are in a settlement is too much for the amount of resources that they have to sustain that population. So it could be because of a drought, the soil qualities become really bad, or there isn't enough water resources, so people are putting too much pressure on that resource. Secondly, poor infrastructure. Remember, infrastructure is things like roads, power lines. If those are not kept up to standard, people are not really going to want to live in that area. There are inadequate job offers, or not enough job offers in those areas. Bad educational chances. Most of our rural areas don't have top-class universities or decent, in a lot of cases, secondary schools. So people want to get the best education possible. So they're going to move away because of that poor education level. Poor healthcare. Okay, no clinics, no hospitals. Ecological problems, which could include things like soil erosion. Perhaps they've overused the soil and all that valuable, fertile topsoil has disappeared, and now they can't farm for themselves and their family. So a subsistence lifestyle is really not working for them anymore. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, and social compulsions could involve things like security issues. There could be war, which causes people to want to leave an area, civil unrest. All those things are not desirable factors. If you have a look at our pull factors, the things that draw people to a city is an improvement in the standard of living. So their quality of life is better. They have better educational and healthcare facilities. Okay, and the availability of services. They have more and varied employment opportunities. They generally get paid better, so they get higher wages. They get better education. There are generally no social compulsions. And also they've got better future prospects. The range of jobs, the lifestyles, the things that they can go into with regard to the multiple services and industries available there will broaden their horizons. So those are the push and pull factors that you guys need to know. Moving on. We need to look at the consequences of rural depopulation. All right. So the diagram that I've put up for you guys there is a very important diagram. They often give it in an exam, and it shows you the cycle of rural decay, which basically means that conditions in rural areas get worse and worse and worse once people start leaving from those areas. And we say it's a self-perpetuating cycle. The conditions just get worse as that cycle continues. So let's have a look at it. When we have a decline in rural employment or a decline in the population, means there's firstly less jobs, so reduced employment. Okay, that causes rural-urban migration, so people want to leave cities. Okay, all right. Then there's a couple of things that could happen after that. First of all, the young, active, and mostly the men leave. So that actually changes your gender structure. The age and the sex structure also changes, okay? Because most of the time it's the women and children and elderly that are left behind to kind of fend for themselves in these rural settlements, while the men try and find work in the cities. So if we have a look here, the old and the very young are left behind, okay? Because we have changes in our sex structures, fewer babies will be born, okay? This creates a reduction in your population, all right? If you have a reduction in your population, it means there's less of a potential for spending in that rural town, and so services kind of have to close down. Shops close down, restaurants will close down, hotels will close down, because there's not enough of a population to actually sustain that activity. So that means that those people that actually run those services will also be out of a job. We have a look here, right? We therefore get poor tertiary services, okay? There's low property prices, and also the homes and the shops become very abandoned, dilapidated, and neglected. Further from that, we have economic stagnation, which means the economy is not going to grow, and we have no new investments as well. So that cycle of rural decay is quite important. We also need to have a look at things like social justice and rural problems. Social justice is a very popular term that they're going to put in your exam. It means that all individuals are entitled to satisfy their basic human needs. They're entitled to all their basic services, all their basic needs. If we have a look at some of the problems associated with social injustice, okay, the spider diagram is quite useful. Okay, so we're looking at issues and problems that are associated with rural settlements. There's quite a few things here that I'm going to run through. Firstly, we've just discussed the depopulation of rural villages, towns, and isolated farms, so less people are living there. There's social injustice, so people are not getting access to their basic needs, things like healthcare, housing, water, electricity, education. They are not up to standard generally in these settlements. They also have a lack of capital and investment. No one's going to put money into a town that's not going to grow or flourish in their economy. There's also limited infrastructure that's also not maintained properly. There will be unemployment because services and shops will have to shut down. There will also be an uneven rural population distribution. There's a lack of services, and they're also not maintained very well. We're going to discuss the concept of land reform in a second, which means that the process of giving people land, who especially were previously disadvantaged, is not happening fast enough. There'll be soil erosion and overgrazing as the remaining people put too much pressure on the resources. Droughts and floods are generally a problem associated with rural areas as well. There'll be poverty, so people will be very poor, and also malnutrition. They probably won't be able to farm enough for themselves. And there'll also be a lack of arable land. Arable land refers to fertile land, so there'll be a lack of fertile land. Let's have a quick look at the rural development strategies. 3 very important definitions here. Rural land reform, okay? You have to state it as such. Means that people are given security of land tenure. Tenure means the legal right to basically use that land. And this includes things like community ownership, okay? Informal ownership of farm workers, and by labor tenants. So people exchange their services to live on that piece of land. Rural land restitution, also another important one, means that land that was forcibly removed from people under apartheid regimes is given back to those people. And the last one, rural land redistribution. That's the third very important term that often comes up. Means that land will be allocated to the poor and disadvantaged people specifically for settlements and farming. There are a number of programs that you have to know. right? And the most, or the latest one is called the Comprehensive Rural Development Program, the CRDP, and it was established in 2009. You have to know the aims, and in your textbooks you'll find that they give you a list of aims, they give you a list of problems and methods by which they're trying to implement the Comprehensive Rural Development Program. Let's have a look at those aims. They want to eliminate food insecurity and poverty. Food insecurity means that everyone in the settlement does not have enough food to meet their normal daily needs. They want to improve or optimize the use and management of natural resources. And they also want to create sustainable rural settlements that consider the environment, the economy, and the society. The methods, very quickly: land reform, which I've just discussed. They want to improve skills, improve the service delivery, improve infrastructure like railway networks, road networks. They want to improve, revitalize rural towns, make them attractive, and also they want to have cooperative development. There are some other programs that may come up in your test and exam, especially when you get case studies. The RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, that was established in 1994, and it involved the basic needs approach. Now, if they're talking about a basic needs approach, it means that they're looking at the everyday things that people require in order to survive. So housing, food, electricity, water, those are basic needs. Then the Integrated Rural Development Program, that was established in the year 2000, which also looks at basic needs, but also focuses on improved farming techniques to optimize the use of that resource. And then the Local Agenda 21, which was established in 2001 after the World Sustainable Development Summit, means that sustainable rural development strategies must be put in place which integrate social, economic, and environmental factors. There's a basic summary of the rural settlement issues as well as potential programs to overcome them. I think it's time for a break.
All right, Mindsetters, let's take a very quick break, but we'll see you straight after this. Welcome back, Mindsetters, from that break. I hope you guys are still enjoying the lesson. I won't waste any more of your time. I'll take us straight back to Michelle.
Thank you very much, Looney. Now that we've looked at a summary of the basic rural settlement issues, you need to be able to apply that to various diagrams and excerpts from newspapers and case studies that they're going to give you. So let's have a look at one or two questions to try and improve these skills. If we have a look at the first question, they give you figure 1, and it's showing the cycle of rural decay, which also occurs in the South African landscape. This often results in rural-urban migration. Remember, people leaving rural areas to move to more cities and towns, resulting in specific problems for rural areas. Let's have a look at the diagram. Fairly similar to what we looked at before, all right? So firstly, all the young, active people, they want a better lifestyle, they want more excitement, they want more entertainment, they want better jobs. They're going to leave to make a better life in the cities. The older people are left behind, and they're too old to work as hard, okay? So they can't produce many crops, they can't handle the workload. The farmland decays and production also decreases, becomes less productive. The income per capita in rural areas is reduced, especially seeing as some of your services and shops will have to close down. And because we don't have a productive farmland anymore, many people are going to starve. Let's have a look at the questions. 1.1, and they usually start with a definition. Define the term rural-urban migration. So there's 2 free marks right there. So remember that rural-urban migration meant that people move from rural areas towards urban areas for a number of reasons. Let's write that down. So people move from rural areas, like villages, to more urban settings, right? Like cities, like towns. Full definition for 2 marks. If you only give half of it, you won't get any marks. Question 1.2. Name, so you don't have to discuss, just name 2 push factors that may result in rural-urban migration. Remember, we were talking about things like the lack of services, the lack of infrastructure. There's also a lack of entertainment in rural areas, so people choose to leave to go to the cities. They might find that natural disasters also force them to move. So luckily, this question's only for 4 marks and 2 factors, but that could possibly also be an essay question. Let's write a couple of things down. So 2 push factors, okay? The lack of service provision, right? Also, the lack of infrastructure, like decent roads, decent railway networks. All right? They could also have a lack of entertainment. All right? We could also include in that answer natural disasters like a drought or a flood, population pressure on the available resources. And there's more than enough for our 4 marks there. Let's have a look at the next question. Right, now we have to discuss 3 consequences or results of rural-urban migration for this rural community. So in your diagram that showed that cycle of rural decay, they've mentioned a few things like the old people get left behind, the land becomes less productive. But when they say discuss the effects or results, you actually need to write a sentence to explain it, you know what is meant by those terms. Okay, let's put a couple of things down. So firstly, we're going to have an aging population. Okay, and the reason behind that is that most of your young people, those are the ones that are going to leave. All right? Your agricultural land becomes unproductive. All right? Agricultural land is unproductive. They can't cope with the workload. Okay? Our services will decline, shops will close down, okay? Our GDP per capita will also decrease because most of the able-bodied people have gone to find work somewhere else. Shops have closed down, people are unemployed, the old people are left behind, so therefore the average earnings will decrease. So there's 4 of them for you. There are others. As long as you've explained 4, you'll be fine. If you have a look at the next question, write a single paragraph, no more than 12 lines, in which you discuss, so everything has to be in a sentence, sustainable strategies that can be used to manage South Africa's declining rural settlements. Now remember that back in apartheid laws, most of the funding or the budgets, government budgets, were associated with urban areas because those were white-dominated settlements. So those areas improved very rapidly, but your rural settlements, they kind of were left in the cycle of decay. And that process hasn't been quite rectified. So there's quite a few things that the governments, non-governmental organizations, privately owned companies try and do to try and uplift these rural settlements. So if you think logically, a lot of our rural towns, they've developed things like their tourism. There's lots of nature reserves in the vicinity. People like to go there, so there's lots of shops and curio shops and hotels that people will like to stay at. They try and revitalize the town, in other words. Okay? You can also attract people back into the town or into the settlement via a number of ways. Your pensioners, for example, if you build nice retirement villages in your rural settings, which are tranquil and peaceful, they are likely to want to come and live in the quiet countryside. You can also attract younger people back to your towns by creating employment opportunities. You can use various programs, rural development strategies, to help uplift the rural communities. Things like the RDP program, things like the basic needs approach, providing basic sanitation, electricity, decent infrastructure. They can improve that as well. Last year in grade 11, you guys did a concept called the Spatial Development Initiative, which actually looks at developing these rural towns as well. So you can mention all of those things in your paragraph. Let's just summarize a couple of those now. So the first thing that we said was that we can improve the tourism. Have hotels, tourist attractions. Okay. You can add or open nature reserves, okay, or game parks. You can attract pensioners back to that area. Okay, remember, if you build nice retirement villages, they are likely to come back. You can also improve skills development for your remaining population so that they are not inclined to move. We can employ initiatives like the the Rural Reconstruction and Development Program, the Spatial Development Initiative, okay, Local Agenda 21, which we looked at earlier. So if you mention all of those things, you are likely to get your marks. There are quite a few other things which you can also incorporate, and as long as they make sense, your markers, if they're logical, your markers are likely to give you the full allocation of marks. Remember, when you're writing your answers in a paragraph, you need to make sure that you don't write in point form and in full sentences so that they won't deduct any marks. Let's have a look at a couple of other questions from another example. Okay. Question 2. You need to read the article on a social justice issue in Figure 2. Remember, social justice means that everyone in that community, in the country, is entitled to satisfy their basic needs. Basic needs being access to water, food, housing, sanitation, electricity. Okay, remember social justice, it will probably come up. Let's have a look at the excerpt. All right. Telling the story about South Africa's rural poor. Okay? Says there, this is a story about the Skosanas. They're interviewed by the social surveys. Until 2001, they survived relatively well on the farm. They had a tap for water. They had firewood, which is obviously their means of cooking, of warmth. Then the farm was sold to a new owner who wanted the Skosanas off the land. For 2 years, they fought eviction. After all, this was the new South Africa, free from apartheid supposedly. And for the first time, they had rights. But the farm owner shut down their water tap and ordered them to stop gathering wood on his land. Finally, the owner came early one morning when the children were still asleep, broke down the door and threw the family's furniture and belongings onto the road. The children were afraid that they would have nowhere to sleep. Mr. Skosana was ill and could not work anymore. Okay? Mrs. Skosana says she will never forget the experience of being thrown out like rubbish, and no one deserves that. Let's have a look at the questions. First of all, that first term, explain what is meant by social justice. As we mentioned before, it means that every individual or every person has the right to satisfy their basic needs. And those are things like sanitation, access to electricity. All right, 1 mark for that definition. You also had to name the social justice issue from the story that it captured, and basically they were thrown off their land or denied access to housing or to a home, which is part of their basic needs, and that's not allowed. 1 mark there. Let's have a look at the next question. This is an interesting one, a little bit more interpretation here. Why is the word new emphasized in the article? Now remember, in the New South Africa, everyone is supposed to have the right to basic needs like housing, water, electricity. But in this case, even after apartheid, these people were still being treated abominably. They were thrown out their house. They were thrown off the land. And remember, there's actually laws in place that say people have the right to use that land through security of land tenure, land reform processes. They have the right to use that land for settlement and distribution. But they were, or settlement and agriculture. But they were thrown off that land and they were evicted in a very cruel way, in a very inhumane way. Right. So even though we're referring to the new South Africa, it means that some of these issues that should have been sorted out, they're not. Okay? In the new South Africa, we still have people without access to their basic needs. So you need to get that point across in this answer. Let's write something down here. So even after apartheid, people are still being denied access or denied the right to satisfy their needs. You can put that in your own words as long as you get the point across. 2 marks for that sentence. Let's have a look at the next 2 questions. Name the law that secures the rights of people who live under insecure conditions or under insecure conditions on land owned by others. And you must call that rural land reform or rural land tenure. Okay? Or land reform tenure. Which means they are granted the right to use and live on that land. 2 marks there. Right. Let's have a look at the next question. Excluding the social justice issue, which we mentioned in question 2.2, you have to discuss 2 other social justice issues experienced in rural areas. So, in other words, what sort of problems are the people themselves in this article been facing, right? So they mentioned things like they didn't have access to decent water supplies. They had to collect firewood to do their daily cooking, for example. So they didn't really have electricity. If they didn't really have electricity, it's probably safe to assume that other services and other infrastructure are not in place. They also mentioned that Mr. Skosana didn't or couldn't get a job, or he didn't have a decent enough job, a well-paying job, so they are therefore stuck in that cycle of poverty and they are unable to earn a decent living. So we need to discuss 2 of those things. Let's write a few things down. All right, so firstly, they didn't have access to water or limited access to water. They also had no access or limited access to things like electricity. They probably had a lack of service delivery like hospitals and schools. All right. And they also probably had a lack of infrastructure. And that will get you your 4 marks, but you only needed 2. Right, moving on. You need to discuss any 2 problems that the government experiences or could experience with this process of land reform. So this idea is all good and well, but there are a number of issues that obviously will arise in trying to implement this process. So obviously this process is taking time. 20 years on from the end of apartheid, we still have people struggling to gain access to land. It takes a lot of time, and there's also a huge cost involved, all right? Sometimes there's lack of support by the government. There's also disputes between owners and new tenants, and that obviously results in quite a few problems. And they also have to consider disputes between the traditional leaders and the government about how much land they are allowed to use. So there's quite a few things here. Let's just write 1 or 2 things down. Right. So firstly, it takes a long time, but too long in many cases. It also involves high cost. Right? Sometimes there's also a lack of support by the government. And there are various disputes which I've just discussed with you. Could be between the landowners that are not willing to sell or to give up their land. It could be between government and traditional leaders about the extent of land. And all of these issues take a long time to resolve. I hope those questions help. Looney, I think it's time for a break.
All right. Mindset is, let's take a quick break. Remember, guys, if we don't get through any of your questions and you want extra help and you need someone to answer your questions when the shows are done, remember we do have a help desk. All you need to do is send your questions to learn.mindset.co.za/help desk and you'll get all the help you need. So at that said, let's take a very quick break. We'll see you shortly after the break. Welcome back, guys. I hope you are still enjoying the show with us. Michelle?
Would you like me to look at the challenge
Yes.
question? All right, let's have a look at that challenge question once more. I've heard that there are some rather interesting and thought-provoking answers coming through, so I'm glad that you guys are thinking a little bit. Let's have a look at it again. Right, it says to explain why large proportions of the populations of provinces like Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and the Eastern Cape are still living in rural settlements. Okay? Now, most of those areas, they don't have major cities or urban developments, and they've kind of remained largely undeveloped. Okay? Now, you need to think back to our apartheid laws, and there is a little excerpt in your books, and I think it occurs in most of your textbooks, that talks about something called the Homelands Policy. All right? Now, that meant, and it wasn't a very fair policy at all, that all of your funding, all of your government spending and development initiatives were associated with urban settlements. And most of those urban settlements were dominated by white populations. Okay? A lot of your land as well was owned, the most fertile arable land was owned by your white farmers, commercial farmers that is. So your black people, people of color, were forced into the homelands, okay, which actually occur in most of those provinces, which generally didn't have any arable land. They were given very small areas of land to try and live off. And they couldn't access the cities or get into the cities to find work unless they had special documents like your dompas. So 20 years on from apartheid, this policy has taken very long it's taken very long to eradicate this policy. So a lot of your populations, your rural black populations, have remained in these settlements, and that's led to a whole bunch of other issues. And some of you've actually mentioned that in your answers, which I'm glad to hear. Because that they were living in these poorer settlements, obviously they didn't get decent schools or health care provided. So that means that their education levels kind of stayed at a very low level. So even if they did move to the cities after apartheid, they wouldn't be able to find work there. So the lack of education is definitely an issue which they've experienced there. Right, so basically because of our homelands policy, we're still seeing the effects of larger populations in these rural settlements. And most of those homelands are basically in Mpumalanga, are basically in Eastern Cape as well as we mentioned in Limpopo province as well. I hope you guys managed to get that question right. Looney?
Should I read you some of the answers?
Okay, let's see what they said.
Okay. Makucha Luti says, because rural settlements are isolated or dispersed, therefore development is difficult to take place or it costs more money for development.
Well, that's also very true. These rural settlements are generally very isolated and dispersed. They're in remote areas sometimes. And it does take a lot more money to actually develop them properly. So, yes, economically speaking, they generally are very difficult to develop as a whole, very expensive. And unfortunately, our budget maybe doesn't cover quite all of those expenses. Any
Here's
other answers?
from Vusongwenya. People in those areas are not so educated. If you can look at the pass rate for the Eastern Cape, it is always among the lowest in the country. Them not being educated leads to having no money, and then in brackets he puts poverty, and there would be no point moving to the city if you have no money or education.
That's excellent. I'm very glad that you actually mentioned that the pass rate in Eastern Cape is extremely low, and that's actually very true. The education levels are generally the lowest in the Eastern Cape. And that kind of refers back to that process of rural decay, whereby people they don't have access to those resources. They're experiencing social injustice, so they're not being educated. So a lot of the children, the women as well, they're forced to work in the farmland areas and try and have a subsistence lifestyle. And that's all they're really equipped to do. So they don't have money, they don't have education. How are they going to cope in a new lifestyle in the cities? So that's a very good answer as well. But notice that all of those issues have actually stemmed from that homelands policy, which basically tried to separate and to keep separated the white population from our black population. Looney, any other answers?
Someone is asking if you could please just repeat the previous question you did with the essay, the long story you
Was
read.
in the first set
Yes.
of questions. All right, let's go back to that. Right. All right, there it is there. All right. Again, we had to discuss sustainable strategies that can be used to manage our declining rural settlements. So to answer that one again, let's just go through a couple of pointers again. Remember, we want to try and keep populations more in rural settlements. We don't want overcrowding and too many people moving to urban settlements. So we want to try and attract people back to those rural settlements. And there are a number of ways in which they're trying to do that, to try and have an even population distribution. So if you want people to move back to a rural town, you've got to make it worth their while. So things like the tourism industry, that's a very good way to start, because if you've got tourist attractions like a game park, for example, you're going to have other services that have to be linked to that. You're going to have people that are working there that need hospitals or clinics. They will need educational facilities and will need to improve infrastructure. So it's a way to draw people linked with tourism and also tourists back to that rural town to improve that economy through tourism. So that's one way, improving tourism, and also to establish more attractions like game reserves. With that question, remember, you could also mention your programs that have been put in place. So the Reconstruction and Development Program, that was from 1994. That program was purely to address poverty and malnutrition and diseases in those rural areas. So looking at basic needs and improving basic needs in those areas, you mention that program, you'll get marks. The basic needs approach, so instead of getting too fancy, they look at what people basically need to perform daily activities. They need decent water supplies, they need electricity, they're going to need decent infrastructure, okay? They're going to need sanitation. And if you improve those specific services, people are going to be more inclined and more comfortable with the idea of living in a rural settlement, okay? Then improving the infrastructure along with that is also a point that you could mention. The Spatial Development Initiative was another one. Local Agenda 21, which generally looked at urban sustainability. All those basic needs and environmental, social, and economic needs can also be incorporated into looking at rural areas. Okay, so if you think logically, again, there are a number of things that you can do to attract people back to those rural settlements, like pensioners, young people, trying to make features that are attractive for them. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. That was from Tabo. And then Nombendula is asking, you see in question 1.1, there's a flow diagram. So she's asking if she would answer her question using a diagram instead of like writing down answers, would she be wrong?
Okay, in question 1.1, they're asking for a definition. So they don't like it if you put it in a flow diagram because you're not illustrating or writing in words that you actually understand the concept. So when they say provide a definition, rather write for rural-urban migration, people that leave rural areas to move to towns and cities. So rather write it out. Any other questions?
There's a 2.4. Nosipo doesn't understand the law. The 2.4, it says name the law that secures the rights of people who live under insecure conditions. I think it's linking to the question about those Kosanas. If you could please explain that again.
Of course. Right. So with land reform, okay, there's obviously laws that are put in place to ensure that everyone has access to resources like land. Okay, so when we're looking at land or rural land tenure is a tricky word because it basically gives people the right to use that land formally or informally as labor tenants. So when they're talking about rural land tenure, that's literally a law that was put in place by the government that says people have to be able to either informally own land or are allowed to use that land legally and live on that land legally. So it's just a law that was put in place to try and speed up or implement the process of land reform. Are there any other questions?
There's a comment from Swabalwe. It's from the challenge question. He says social justice and the issue of rural land reform are not fully resolved in SA's rural areas. Would that be an acceptable answer?
Just repeat that comment again.
Okay. Social justice and the issue of rural land reform are still not fully resolved in SA's rural areas.
Your answer is correct, but they're trying to get you to refer back to the Homeland's policy. They want you to understand and to show them that you understand that apartheid law separated black people into the homeland areas, rural areas, and white people into urban areas. Okay, so make sure that you mention somewhere in your answer homeland policy that forced these people into these areas, which led to underdevelopment, which is obviously still not resolved after apartheid. I hope that helps.
No, yeah, we're done now. We don't have any more questions.
All right, so let's have a look at the test yourself questions. I'm not going to give away too many of the answers, but let's have a look quickly at the diagram, and we still have a little bit of time. Okay, so this more touches on what you did last week, your different settlement patterns. So just to point a few out, notice where your clustered patterns are. They're grouped together. Okay, there's some shapes as well that we did. There's your linear shape in your of your rural settlement there, located along a linear feature. You've got some isolated or dispersed farms here for commercial farming. And also notice that you've got an isolated farmstead here. So remember to notice the difference between the shape, okay, like the circular shape, and a pattern, which would be clustered. All right, so have a look at that diagram, see if we're running out of time, but let's see if you can get all of those questions right so you can win that calculator. I think that's all we have time for, Looney.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle. Mindsetters, don't forget to go through all the test yourself questions to stand yourself a chance to win this awesome calculator from Casio. Has more than 254 functions, so it's an absolutely amazing thing to have, guys. Remember, our show is proudly brought to you by Macmillan, so thank you so much for tuning in. We love you very much, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place, but from us. Until then, remember to always learn more and learn extra. Goodbye.